Hello, my name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and for the past 5 years, I've had this program, Dollars and Cents, where I've talked about money, essentially. And how I came into this position was 2 years before then, in 2007, I delivered a paper before a closed network called the Positive Deviant Network, and it was a 148-page paper, and in that paper I predicted that we were about to hit another Great Depression. Except this time it would be worse, because it would be accompanied by a catastrophic collapse of currencies. I was lucky, and I want to say that I was lucky, because soon after I made the prediction, I delivered the paper on March 1st, 2007, and that July, two multi-billion-dollar hedge funds, Bear Stearns hedge funds, filled with subprime debt, collapsed, going to absolutely zero. A month and a half later, a credit contraction shook global credit markets, sending seismic shockwaves throughout the global economy, culminating 1 year later in the collapse of the Wall Street banks in 2008. AIG, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, all went down. And so would the rest of the financial edifice, had not central banks used taxpayer money and bailed out banks all around the world. I began my program in 2009 talking about money and explaining it. Now, when I started my study of economics issues, the Depression, I had no understanding of what money was. And I had to figure it out for myself. And I think one of the things that helped me on it is I went into it without preconceived notions. My background was in political science, not economics. And so I was interested in power, questions of power, quite naturally. But regarding economics, I was not privy to the internecine warfare going on at the time between the left and the right. The left represented by the Keynesians, and the right represented by, quote, the Friedmanites. Two politically polarized ideologies all around the issue of money. Where these ideologies found common ground was in their dispensing of gold as money. The Keynesians on the left espoused paper money in all of its forms, as did the followers of Milton Friedman on the right. Both the ideological positions regarding money were firmly ensconced in the 250-year tradition that had started in England in 1694 and eventually took over the whole world. When I began looking at what caused the Great Depression, essentially issues of massive amounts of credit leading to speculative bubbles so large that when they collapsed in their wake was left total economic devastation. When I began looking at that more closely, I discovered the role of money in this. And not what we thought money was, because I didn't know what money was. I remember thinking about the 1930s, what happened to all the money? It stopped going around, I knew that. Most people didn't have it, people were starving, hardship beset the land. And my question, what happened to the money, was answered in a very roundabout way. When it occurred to me, sometime later, that it wasn't the money that disappeared, it was credit. And that money in the modern economic system had become a form of circulating debt. Before the Bank of England, before central banking in 1694, money all around the world, since time immemorial, which may be far longer than we know it, or our memory of it, money was a form of savings, something that somebody would give you for what you had done, for services rendered or for what you sold them. And you weren't certainly going to take something that had no value or had negative value, all right? And this was true all the way until 1694, when the Bank of England was established by a charter by the King of England, and the Bank of England began issuing debt-based paper banknotes alongside the silver and gold coins issued by the Treasury of England. Well, it is an English axiom that bad money drives out good, And over the next couple hundred years, gold and silver disappeared from circulation, leaving only the paper banknotes circulating, quote unquote, as money. And when I began my study of the Great Depression, I discovered that what had disappeared during the Great Depression appeared to be money, but was really credit. Credit disappeared, leaving in its wake massive amounts of debt. And that was an insight to me, because I realized something that we all think we know something about. Money was not what it seemed to be. And not only was money not what it seemed to be, in its new guise was far more important, far more consequential, and far more dangerous than we had given it attribute to. In the modern banking economy, circulating credit turns into debt instantly and becomes constantly compounding interest. This is the devil's whip upon which modern economies are driven, forcing all economies to constantly grow to pay off constantly compounding debt. A vestige of this is seen when you read the newspapers and you hear the sanguine remarks of economists or politicians saying, what we need to do is we need growth. We need more growth. Well, what they're really saying is that there's so much debt out there that unless we can accelerate the growth, we're going to be buried underneath an avalanche of constantly compounding debt that has already been set in motion and has already threatened to take us down now. That is because of what money has become. And I explained in the last 5 years on Dollars and Cents, not only about money and economics, I explained how money as debt and credit enabled England to go from a small offshore island off the coast of Normandy with much far larger neighbors, and within 100 years, essentially 120 years, take over the known world. Why? Well, I explained that when Bank of England started using credit as money, or debt as money, the Rothschilds made a fortune on floating government loans to the government of England. The banking house of Rothschild, which already owned the Royal Mint in England, was the financial institution that invented government bonds, debt. By the issuance of these bonds, it allowed England, its patron, to go to war on credit. Now, let me assure you, those English naval officers and armies and whatever else they fielded may have been deadly and vicious and horrible and knocked over everybody they ran into. But along the way, they absorbed countries such as Turkey. And the Turks have a fearsome reputation that would put the English to shame. Well, how did they do this? Because the English were able to mobilize vast navies, arms, and guns by the use of credit, which Turkey was not able to do. And as long as English armies and navies won, they could pay back the bankers' credit, which had now become debt, with sufficient interest. The crown jewel in England's crown was India, which they raped and basically looted of its centuries of wealth, leading to the great manor houses, which the world has fallen in love with on Masterpiece Theater. This is what has characterized the last 250 years, or 300 years. The central bank, the Bank of England, once the English Empire was incapable of enlarging itself, was moved quickly by the bankers to the United States, the colony that got away. The crown colonies that fought a war with England so they would not be victims of the system of credit and debt that the bankers had already enslaved the English nation with. Thomas Jefferson, one of the great founding fathers of the United States of America, said, standing armies themselves are less of a threat to the safety and security of the United States than our private bankers. Notwithstanding these words of tremendous wisdom, in 1913, December 23rd, basically in the middle of the night, the Congress voted to implement the Federal Reserve Bank. This was the first act of privatization of a government function. No longer was the United States nor its people in charge of its destiny, at least its economic destiny. From that point on, money would not be issued by the United States Treasury. It would be issued instead by the United States Federal Reserve Bank, a bank that was not a federal institution, not really even the United States, it was the Federal Reserve Bank, nor was it a public institution. It was a consortium of private banks, European banks, that now was going to issue money in the United States. And it did so. Since that time, the United States dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power. The United States government has become the world's largest debtor. And although it fueled a tremendous era of expansion in the interim, in its aftermath, as we speak in 2014, we as a nation are saddled with so much debt it can never be repaid. We are in the last stages of that extraordinary system of banking started by England, forced upon the United States by the bankers, and transferred to the rest of the world. And to most of those who are walking around in this world today, they have no idea how this happened. To them, it's like history. Sure, England, the empire, the greatest empire since Rome. They don't know how it happened. They don't know the difference of money before central banking. They don't even know what money is. They just think, I can buy something with it. A piece of paper. And it is. But it's also the reason why this system that has lasted for 300 years is in its final stages. We are now in the final stage of credit and debt economies that the economist Hyman Minsky called Ponzi financing. In the beginning of every credit and debt economy, debts are paid out of productivity. Money is borrowed, the enterprise is started, throws off profits, and the profits pay down both the compounding interest and the principal upon which that debt was issued. In the Middle Ages, in the middle times of these economies, debts grow, and the ability to generate profits becomes harder and harder and harder. And its final stages, debts are now so large and growth is so slow, at least in reference to the size of that growing mountain of debt, that what is generated by the economy at large is unable to pay down the interest on that constantly compounding debt, let alone the principal. And in this last stage, Hyman Minsky called Ponzi financing. Borrowing money that does not exist to pay debts that do. We have been in this position for 50 years. It wasn't so after World War II. The massive amount of government military spending by the United States when we had dreams of world dominion, where we became allies, where we took the air of England, the country we had fought a war of independence, and instead became England's replacement in the imposition of the bankers' order on the rest of the world. This epoch is over. Whether or not people understand it, whether or not people understand the role of money, whether or not people understand what actually is going on, it's like AIDS. You don't have to understand the mechanism by which this disease works. All you have to do is to have caught it. You don't even have to know that you have it. It will slowly work its way, destroying your immune system first, and making life unbearable, and eventually snuffing out life itself. Such is the system you call capitalism. Capitalism has been associated with free markets by the bankers. Let me assure you, free markets existed far before capitalism. Capitalism lives off free markets as it lives off everything else. Capitalism is no arbiter of freedom or of totalitarianism. Economies grow better when they're left by themselves to grow. And the bankers care not, as long as it's their debt-based money that fuels economic growth and pays the interest on the loans that are issued in that economy. It's been 7 years since I delivered that paper at the Positive Achievement Network and predicted an economic collapse. We're 7 years closer to that ultimate collapse. And in 2009, I started this program, issuing videos where I would talk about money, power, etc. And I've pretty much exhausted the subject. Let me assure you, modern economics has not changed that much since I began talking about it. What has changed is the time left remaining to it. Since 2008, aggregate private and public debt has increased by $100 trillion on this planet. And that $100 trillion has gone not to make things better. It has merely kept the sinking ship afloat. That ship is about to sink. And as I've ended each one of my articles with the following words: buy gold, buy silver, have faith. I meant those words to give you direction and sustenance and some understanding to meet this great period of change in which we are now living. There's very little I have to add to the dialogue. There's very little insight that I can contribute to the discourse. And so what I'm going to do is switch directions. Just as much as I deconstructed money, a couple of months ago I issued a dollars and cents program, some of you may still remember, called Deconstructing Money, Deconstructing Reality, in which I talked about each and how each was neither what anybody thought it was. Just as you are blind, we are blind to the real reality of money. Each of us is exactly blind to the world that we inhabit, that we think is real and we believe it to be real. Just as much as we believe somehow that that piece of paper with writing on it, colored, is money. If it is money, it's certainly not money in the form it was 300 years ago. What we consider reality is also not the reality that we consider it. In February, I was asked to give a talk at the Liberty Mastermind Symposium in Las Vegas. And it gave me an inspiration as to where I was going to head, where I was going to take this program and these little talks that I have been giving for the past 5 years. And since I've pretty much exhausted the issue of money and economics, I'm going to talk about something even more hidden and even more consequential than money. I'm going to talk about liberty and how the whole issue of liberty is as opaque and hidden in its true nature as is money itself. In that video, when I deconstructed reality and money, I used this as a metaphor for your world. And what I said was this: when each of us is born, we have a blank disk called memory. All right? These may even be Memorex. All right? Whatever it is. This is an These are CDs. They're filled with empty, in their original form, filled with empty gigabytes. All right? Gigabytes are these electronic widgets that can absorb information. And so when we're born, this disk that we don't even know exists, we haven't the faintest idea that it is there, begins to become filled with our thoughts, our observations about everything. When we come into this world, this is blank. When we die after a full lifetime, it is filled to overflowing. And in a great truth, has stopped growing for most of us since a rather early time in life. These discs, starting out as open, become rigid. These discs, starting out as curious and receiving all information, become self-selective of what is allowed to be placed on that disc. And in that program, I explain that each of us, with these discs, each of us fills this disc with different information. If you were, for example, born in the Middle East, your parents are Shiites, Muslim, it is rather certain that you're going to grow up with a disc filled, partially filled, with the edicts of the Shiite Muslim religion. If, however, you grew up in the Middle East and your parents were Jewish, your disc would be filled with entirely different information. What I want to tell you about these two discs is the person with the first disc, the Muslim, is probably going to have feelings of great antipathy, rage, anger, bitterness, and hatred of the person with a disc born Jewish, who is going to have like feelings, attitudes, and judgments about the person with the first disc who is Muslim. Why? Well, it's a rather curious phenomenon about these discs. As we take this program further, we're going to find out that what is loaded on each one of our discs is not neutral. In the beginning, it may appear to be that way. And to most of us, as we move through life, it remains and it still appears to be neutral. But I'm going to show how this is not true at all. That each one of us has a self-selection process that locks us further and further into what is in our discs. That these discs, once open to new knowledge, become locked to anything that is at odds, at variance with what is previously on that disc. If you were born at a time when you were told that the earth was flat, and some astronomer, Galileo, Copernicus, or whatever, said the opposite, no. Your disc is self-locked against that new information. This is why we feel trapped. And in the last program of Dollars and Cents, I said I was going to move the direction of this series into another area just as opaque, just as misleading, and far more consequential than money itself. This is the area of reality, or what we call reality. And what I explained at the end of the last program, I use the metaphor of a disk, a memory disk. We use this with our computers. That when we're born, every memory, every experience that we have gets put on this disk. Each of us has one, whether we know it or not. We don't even have a name for it. The closest name we have for it is a description of what it does. Memory is one such description. But that's all it is. It's a description of one of its functions. This disk, like money itself, has many functions. Some obvious, some less obvious, some hidden, even from the disk itself. I explain that what is on that disk is highly personal. Each one of us has one. And the data that's entered on each of our disks is quite different from those around us. In a very large sense, there's geographical differences, religious differences, cultural differences. I explain that a child growing up in an Israeli settlement in Israel is going to have different data on his disk than a Palestinian child growing up on the Gaza Strip. That each one is probably, since we are generally victims of our disk, the word victim is wrong, I think reflections of what we have on our disk, is going to harbor feelings that we well understand. All right? Because each one of us believes that what is on our disk is true, whether or not it is or not. I explained at the end of the last show that once that disk starts being filled, what comes onto that disk, what we allow onto that disk, becomes increasingly vetted by what's already on it. If, for example, you grew up at the time when everybody thought the world was flat, and at this time that you were growing up, some person came up with the idea, or at least said, no, the world is not flat, it's spherical. But everything that you knew, everybody that you knew, the wise, the ignorant, the stupid, the dumb, the deaf, and the blind, all agreed that the world was flat. And probably that the sun went around the earth, if you lived in Western Europe. Other parts of the world had totally different points of view. But if that was your cultural background, and the idea that the world was round and that the world went around the sun, it would be met with a great deal of resistance by you and everyone else, upon who the older paradigm was accepted as what we call gospel truth. Gospel truth is a word, a common parlance, a description of what we believe to be true without question. And let me explain to you something. If it's not questioned, it may or may not be true. And we, because of the way these disks are set up, because of the way life is structured at its very core, we don't question what is on our disk. And I want to explain why. As we are growing up, the impressions coming in, the observations that we make, tell us certain things about our experience, about what we see, quote, out there, what appears to be out there. One is this: we are separate from the world. We have no idea even who we are. But you know that that person, either your mother, your father, the child, the nurse, the nanny, the dog, the playpen, is not you. You know that. You know that as a truth, as a gospel truth, so to say. No more, no less. But your experience tells you that whatever that dog is, it's not you. Whatever that playpen is, it's not you. Whatever that mother is, she's not you. And whatever your father is, he's not you. And you know this, not even knowing gender. The word he or she. You know there's a difference between the mother and the father. And you know instinctively what that difference is. You have no words for it. All right? And this is all on your disk. The information that is put on it, building up, moment by moment, second by second, reinforces what is already on that once empty disk. And at its closest state to its original virgin state is the thought, the belief, the gospel truth that whatever life is, it is not you. It is something that you are experiencing, something far bigger than you, and that you have very little power in it. You are born essentially helpless as a child. And what is on your disk in those very early moments reinforces this. And again, so does your experience of life itself. This is done before you start thinking. This is a result of the flood of information. Bytes about this, about that come flooding into your world. And the idea that you're alone, without power, is as true on that little Israeli child's disk, whose parents are Orthodox Jews who believe they're living in the promised land that God told them was theirs, as it is in the life of that Palestinian child who used to live on that land for centuries, and they thought that land was theirs too. Each one believes himself or herself, separate, distinct, vulnerable, needing power. And this is all done in the very early stages of that disk filling up with information. The word we have for it is memory. What we don't know about memory is we think it's neutral. We think memory is just the sum experience of what we've experienced. Neutral. And because it's neutral, our experience of it is true. Why? Because that's the experience of everyone with a disk. Everyone who has a disk believes their experiences are true. Those who were born at a time when the world was believed to be flat believes the gospel truth that the world is in fact flat. Perhaps 30 years later, they themselves, the same person, would now believe that they were wrong. Why? Because they knew the world was round? No. Because agreement in that culture had changed over the next 30 years to the new agreement that the world was round. Now, I personally don't know. I'm taking it on faith that the cultural miasma of which I am a part of believes it round, believes we're in a three-dimensional experience of reality, and I will accept it. But I also know that if I were born at another time with a different belief, I would believe that too. Everybody's disk reinforces the idea that they are right about everything, irrespective of what is on that disk. Why? Why is there such an overriding need to take raw data, raw experience, and transform a neutral experience into something loaded with the belief that that is the truth. How does the truth of the individual, small t, because everybody's experience is true. Everybody's experience is true. If you've come to the conclusion that organized religion is a fraud, and its existence is much to the detriment of the advancement of humanity, you may then well come to the point of view that there is no, quote, God. Fine. That's a thought. That's a belief. But what I want to point out is that belief, that thought, which is true to you at that moment, becomes truth. How does a thought process, an observation, an assumption, go from truth with a small t to truth with a large T? And in the answer to this is why we have wars. In the answer to this question is why we fight with each other. In the answer to this question is the reason we don't get along. War of the Worlds? I think it would be probably more true to call it a war of the discs. And there aren't just two discs. I think there's around 2 billion of these floating on the planet at this time. Each filled with different data, each filled with different experiences. Each disc being a part of somebody who believes that that disc is not only that they are truth, that they are right. Well, the reason why we move from a small t to a large t is because of the fragility of what is on that disc. What happens as you grow up, as everyone grows up, that disc fills. It fills with data, your own personal data, reinforcing the beliefs that you have as grown up and build upon. Some of those beliefs may be cultural. Some of those beliefs may be gender-based. God knows boys are a little more violent than girls. All right? And as such, they have different beliefs and attitudes about the world. And God knows they don't share those same core beliefs. But God also knows that each person believes that their version is true with a big T. Why? Because the truth is this. What is on that disc is an accident to a very great degree. It's an accident of experience. If experience is an accident, and it may not be, but we're not going to get into that now. But it is certainly an accident of your experiences. If you are born into a body where you become a world-class athlete, your belief about physical activity and your self-esteem is quite different than the person born with polio. And each person's experience forms their beliefs about themselves, the world, and their place in it. Each one of us has on that disc, as we grow up, it builds up and builds up and builds up. These empty bites, these apparently disparate experiences, these thoughts that come at us from the culture in which we live, from the TV in which we watch, from the video games that we play, from the mean kid next door, and builds a facsimile of the self. This facsimile of the self, which is found on that disc, isn't real. It isn't real. It was formed by the accretion of memory and experience. But in the abeyance of knowing what is real, we identify with what is on our disc. We believe we are that. If you've grown up in a household with a manic attachment to the Chicago Cubs, probably as a kid you were given a t-shirt that says Chicago Cubs on it, and you went to your family reunions and the man patted you on the back and the Women say, what a cute kid. Reminds you of his uncle. You have a strong identification with that. You believe that's who you are. Not in totality, but a part of who you are. So what is on that disc is an aggregate of separate information, attitudes, judgments, identifications with all these little bits that you have formed in sort of a mud pie or a clay figure of a person that you will say is you. If you took a test and they said, what best describes you? That same kid would say, you are a Chicago Cubs fan. You go, yes, that's me. All right? And if on that same test it said, you are a fan of the New York Mets, you go, no, that's not me. All right? On another part of that test, if you grew up in a strict Lutheran household, why? Well, I would say your parents may be from Germany. Your grandparents are from Germany. They came to the United States. They wanted to keep that same sense of familiarity, that same sense of community, that same sense of us, that same identity, and we're able to do this against these exigencies of change. Then you were probably raised in a Lutheran church in some community, perhaps in the upper Midwest. And you identify with being a Lutheran. That's part of your clay image. That's part of your image of self. Well, the truth is this. There is a self in you, and it isn't that image. There's a part of you that is watching. There's a part of you that is watching the process. It doesn't interject itself. We call it the unconscious, the subconscious, the superconscious. Why? Because that disc is conscious. Or so we think. It is conscious. But it's conscious in a very limited, narrow way. The disc, however, doesn't believe it's conscious in a narrow way. No! The disc believes it's open to all reality. The disc believes it is experiencing life in all of its manifest forms and experiences, and believes that what it has experienced is true. It has thrown out the truth from the false. The truth of the matter is this. Ever since its very earliest moments, it began to filter, form, categorize, and began disallowing data that would otherwise conflict with previous data on that disk. Why? Because if you have formed, as a part of your sense of self, a fundamental idea, or an idea as fundamental about the world being flat, the introduction of an idea that it is round is extraordinarily threatening to that clay image of yourself. There are certain beliefs in that image that you've constructed that are core. And these thoughts revolve around your ideas of self. You don't know who you are, but you know the aggregate pieces quite well. And it's because you don't know at a very deep, basic level of who you are so easily threatened by any idea that differs what is on that disc. If, however, you knew that disc was a rolling experience, if, however, you knew that disc was instead akin to a river, that at certain points on that river's journey, it would be going through a chasm with deep mountains. It would look at those mountains and go, oh, this is what it is. But what happens is that disc if it does go through a chasm with deep mountains for a large part of its life, and then all of a sudden the river turns into a flat area, the disk becomes scared. Because what is new threatens whatever was on that disk before. Any new idea is automatically threatening to what is on that disk that does not agree with it, whether or not it is, quote, true or not. This is why that disk is so vulnerable, unsteady. This is why that disk is so affected. This is why the disk becomes rigid and ossified rather than continue to grow, accept, and expand. Because the false sense of self that grows up on everybody's disk is inherently fragile and inherently not true. It may capture the truth of you when you were 2. But that truth, let me assure you, is inadequate for who you become when you're 6. And because of the fragile nature of information, with every core of our insecure being, we fight to stabilize that untrue picture of ourselves. A picture that includes religion, God, sexuality, everything that we're taught, everything that we experience. And we start shutting it down. Survival becomes our only intent. Survival. Why? Because you know you're not the only disc on the block. You know that there's millions of other discs out there. You know that even if your collection of discs is a number like this, that could be your country. All of you share certain beliefs. Well, there's another stack of discs that may even be larger, that have, for whatever reason, another set of beliefs. And those beliefs, in their essence, somehow threaten yours. And you don't even know why, and neither do they. This is the conundrum in which we find ourselves in 2014. One word that may have relevance to this disc is the word matrix. All right? Matrix. A movie came out, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. And the movie was of this person who found himself trapped. Right? There were forces pushing him around. He wasn't free. He was trapped. His word for what he found himself in was a matrix. It was like a web. And this word caught and struck a resonance with human beings all over the planet. Even though all human beings had a different disc, had different feelings, different memories. That matrix is there. That matrix is what we're going to be talking about in future programs.